Sometimes it doesn't take a world war or a massive disaster to shake the global economy. All it takes is a small dispute between two close neighbors. When those neighbors happen to be the United States and Canada, the consequences can spill far beyond their borders. Right now, a storm is brewing over something most of us depend on every single day: energy. Here's the situation. Washington is demanding more access to Canada's energy resources, while Ottawa is pushing back with threats of energy cutbacks. This tension has already sparked provocative talk, with some voices in America jokingly, and sometimes not so jokingly, referring to Canada as the 51st state. At first, that sounds almost absurd. Canada is fiercely proud of its independence and identity, but behind the humor lies a very real struggle, one that touches oil, gas, electricity, and even nuclear fuel. And if these two countries collide over energy, it's not just North America that will feel it. The ripple effects could reach the other side of the globe. So, how did we get here? To understand the stakes, we first need to look at the energy map of North America and see just how deeply the United States depends on Canada's resources. To see why this dispute matters so much, imagine North America as one big power grid, with energy flowing back and forth across invisible pipelines and cables. On that map, Canada is the giant reservoir sitting on top of the United States, feeding it a constant stream of vital resources. Start with oil. Canada holds the world's third largest proven reserves, thanks mostly to the oil sands in Alberta. A massive share of United States crude oil imports comes from this one province, shipped south through pipelines that stretch like arteries across the border. Then there's natural gas. Every single day, billions of cubic feet of Canadian gas travel into the United States through cross-border pipelines. That gas keeps American homes warm in winter, powers factories, and even fuels electricity grids. Without it, some United States states would struggle to keep the lights on. But the story doesn't end there. Canada is also a leader in hydropower. Provinces like Quebec and Manitoba operate huge hydroelectric dams, sending cheap, clean electricity into northeastern states like New York and Massachusetts. On the Pacific side, British Columbia's hydro exports power parts of the U.S. West Coast. Put simply, Canada is like a giant fuel tank next door, hooked up to America by pipes, wires, and contracts. And that means whenever politics get messy, this flow of energy becomes the most powerful bargaining chip on the table. So, what exactly triggered the current clash between Washington and Ottawa? Let's look at the spark that set off this latest round of tension. The current tension didn't appear out of thin air. It was set off by a series of protectionist moves from Washington, especially under Donald Trump's America First agenda. Tariffs on steel, aluminum, and even agricultural products suddenly made it more expensive for Canadian goods to enter the United States market. For Ottawa, this wasn't just an economic headache. It felt like a direct challenge to Canada's role as America's closest trade partner. In politics, pressure almost always produces pushback. And Canada's biggest pressure point is clear energy. When tariffs cut into Canadian industries, voices in Ottawa started hinting that they could respond by tightening the energy taps. It wasn't a formal threat, but the message was obvious. If you squeeze us on trade, don't expect unlimited access to our resources. Adding fuel to the fire was the rhetoric coming out of Washington. Some United States politicians and commentators leaned into the 51st state joke, suggesting that Canada is already so integrated it might as well be absorbed. To Canadians, this wasn't funny. It was humiliating, and humiliation changes negotiations. When national pride is on the line, leaders are more willing to escalate, even if it risks economic damage. So here we are, the United States applying tariffs to protect its industries and Canada holding on to its energy leverage like a loaded card in a poker game. The stage is set for a showdown. But how powerful is that card really? Could Canada truly disrupt America's energy flow if it wanted to? When people talk about Canada's energy card, it's not just a metaphor. It's a very real source of power in negotiations. But to understand how strong this card is, we need to break it down. In the short term, Canada could tighten the flow of natural gas or electricity exports. That would immediately drive up heating costs in northern United States states and push electricity prices higher in places like New England. These are the kinds of moves that would be felt right away by ordinary families and businesses. In the medium term, Cutting oil exports would sting even more. Since the United States imports a huge share of its crude from Alberta, shutting down or even reducing pipeline flows would leave refiners scrambling. Prices at the pump could spike within days, and industries that rely on fuel would be forced to pay more. But in the long term, the real question is whether Canada can reroute its energy to other markets, like China, Japan, or Europe. The problem is infrastructure. Building new LNG terminals, export pipelines, or deepwater ports takes years and billions of dollars. So while Canada talks about diversification, the United States remains its most practical and immediate buyer. That's why experts say an outright energy cutoff isn't very likely. It would hurt Canada almost as much as the United States, but as a threat, it's powerful. Even the possibility of a disruption makes Washington nervous, because energy isn't something you can replace overnight. So yes, Canada's energy card is real, but, how it's played depends heavily on domestic politics. And inside Canada, not everyone agrees on how far to push the United States. Canada is not a single unified voice when it comes to energy policy. In fact, the country's regions often see the United States relationship through very different lenses. Take Alberta. This province is the engine of Canada's oil and gas industry. Pipelines, oil sands, drilling, it's the backbone of their economy. For Alberta, the United States is the lifeline. Tariffs that shrink profit margins are devastating. But at the same time, Alberta producers can't simply pack up and sell their crude to Asia overnight. Without new ports and pipelines, they're stuck with the United States market. That leaves Alberta frustrated. They don't want to be cut off, but they also, resent being pushed around. Now let's shift to Quebec, a province with a completely different outlook. Quebec's power comes from massive hydroelectric dams, not oil. And culturally, many French-speaking Quebecers already feel distant from U.S. influence. So when talk of Canada being treated like the 51st state comes up, Quebec's reaction is sharper. Absolutely not. They see energy independence not just as an economic issue, but as a cultural shield. In Ottawa, the federal government has to balance these competing voices. On one hand, they need to protect national pride and stand up to Washington. On the other, they know that cutting off energy would risk jobs, revenue, and trade stability. It's, honestly, a constant balancing act between defending sovereignty and keeping the economy afloat. This internal divide shapes how Canada plays its energy card. But whichever region you look at, the same question looms. If tensions keep rising, what would the actual economic fallout look like for both sides? So let's imagine the unthinkable. Canada actually turns down the energy tap to the United States. What happens next? For the United States, the pain would be immediate. Oil prices could spike within days, adding dollars to every gallon of gas. Industries from airlines to trucking would face higher operating costs, and inflation would creep higher across the economy. Even electricity in some border states would become more expensive, especially in regions that import Canadian hydro or natural gas. Politically, no United States president wants to explain to voters why gas suddenly costs 30 or 40% more. For Canada, though, the story is more complicated. Shutting off the United States means cutting off their biggest customer. Oil companies in Alberta would be stuck with barrels of crude and nowhere to sell them fast enough. Revenues would collapse, jobs would vanish, and the government's tax base would take a serious hit. In fact, some economists argue Canada would bleed money even faster than the United States in this kind of standoff. Globally, the ripple effects could be huge. Less Canadian oil on the market would tighten global supply, raising prices in Europe and Asia too. Countries like China might see an opportunity, offering Canada investment to redirect energy exports. But again, that requires years of infrastructure Canada doesn't yet have. In short, it's a lose-lose scenario. The United States would pay more at the pump, and Canada would watch its economy stumble. That's why energy brinkmanship usually stops short of a full cutoff. It's a weapon, but one that hurts the person swinging it almost as much as the target. Which leads to the bigger question, if cutting energy is so risky, what's really driving Canada to consider playing this card at all? At the heart of this dispute, energy isn't just about money, it's about sovereignty. For many Canadians, being seen as dependent on the United States feels like giving up part of their national identity. This is why political leaders in Ottawa often speak in symbolic terms when dealing with Washington. They know that, Even if cutting oil or gas exports would be economically painful, the act of threatening it sends a powerful message. Canada is not America's backyard. We've seen this dynamic before. Think back to disputes over softwood lumber, dairy, or aluminum. Each time, Canada didn't just argue about prices. It defended the principle of being treated as an equal partner, not a subordinate. Energy magnifies this tension because it is Canada's biggest leverage point. For politicians, the optics matter as much as the outcome. In Alberta, defending oil exports is about protecting jobs. In Quebec, standing firm against Washington plays into cultural pride. And for Ottawa, it's about proving Canada can push back on its much larger neighbor without folding. This is why energy becomes such a political symbol. Even if Canada never closes the taps, simply raising the idea rallies domestic support and forces the United States to take their concerns more seriously. But symbolism can only go so far. At some point, real decisions have to be made, and that's where the future of Canada's energy strategy comes into play. If Canada truly wants to reduce its dependence on the United States, it needs more than tough talk. It needs new infrastructure, and that's where the long-term energy strategy comes in. Right now, about 90% of Canadian oil exports flow south to the United States. That makes Canada incredibly vulnerable. If Washington imposes tariffs or twists the rules, Canada has few alternatives. To fix that, Canadian leaders and energy companies have pushed for new pipelines and shipping routes to Asia and Europe. Projects like the Trans Mountain expansion aim to give Canada's oil direct access to Pacific markets. In theory, this means Alberta crude could be shipped to Japan, South Korea, or even China. Similarly, proposals for new LNG terminals on the east and west coasts would let Canada export natural gas across the Atlantic and Pacific. The idea is simple: diversify. The more customers you have, the less any single one can hold you hostage. It's the same logic as not putting all your money in one stock. But here's the catch. These projects take years, sometimes decades, and face fierce opposition from environmental groups, indigenous communities, and even some provincial governments. Every delay makes Canada more reliant on the United States in the short run, even as it dreams of independence in the long run. So Canada's strategy is clear. Build more routes, find more buyers, and reduce the United States' stranglehold. But the road to that future is slow, expensive, and politically messy. Which raises the final question. In this clash of tariffs and energy threats, who really holds the upper hand? Canada or the United States? So after all the threats, tariffs, and talk of shutting off energy, where does this really leave Canada and the United States? The truth is, both sides hold leverage, but both sides also face real risks. Canada's energy exports are its strongest bargaining chip, but using them recklessly could cripple its own economy. The United States, meanwhile, has the size and financial muscle to pressure Canada, but it can't easily replace Canadian oil, gas, or electricity without causing major price shocks at home. In other words, this is a stalemate built on interdependence. Canada needs United States buyers. The United States needs Canadian energy. Neither side can afford a clean break, at least not yet. That's why this dispute is less about an actual shutdown and more about drawing red lines. For Canada, it's about showing Washington that there are limits to how far it can push without consequences. For the United States, it's about reminding Canada who the bigger partner in the relationship is. Looking forward, the balance will depend on whether Canada succeeds in diversifying its exports. If new pipelines to Asia or LNG terminals to Europe finally become reality, Canada's hand gets stronger. But until then, Ottawa is walking a tightrope, using energy as leverage while knowing it can't afford to overplay it. In the end, this isn't just about oil or tariffs. It's about sovereignty, survival, and the future of one of the closest and most complicated partnerships in the world.